October 1962. For 13 pivotal, agonizing days that stretched into an eternity, the world held its collective breath, teetering precariously on the precipice of an unimaginable, self-inflicted annihilation. The two colossal global superpowers, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, locked in an ideological and geopolitical death struggle known, with chilling understatement, as the Cold War, stood eyeball to eyeball, their vast and terrifying nuclear arsenals primed and pointed. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, had reached its terrifying apotheosis. How did humanity, in its supposed age of reason and progress, find itself just scant minutes, a single miscalculation, a rash decision away from a global nuclear holocaust? And through what labyrinthine, precarious blend of high-stakes secret diplomacy, clandestine backchannel negotiations, overt military brinkmanship, the sheer weight of leadership, and perhaps an unquantifiable element of sheer, dumb luck, was the ultimate, world-ending catastrophe averted? Welcome to Old Around the World, where we travel back in time to bring history back to life. This is the intricate and terrifying story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a direct, unblinking, and deeply perilous confrontation that brought the Cold War to its most dangerous, its most existentially threatening flashpoint. It was a crisis that ripped away the veneer of superpower invulnerability, exposing the raw, terrifying logic of nuclear deterrence when deterrence itself seemed on the verge of failure. But it also revealed, in stark relief, the complex human drama of leaders under immense, almost unbearable pressure, forced to navigate a treacherous path back from the brink, with the fate of civilization resting squarely on their shoulders. It was a moment that forever seared itself into the global consciousness, a moment that fundamentally altered the course of the Cold War and left an indelible, cautionary mark on the conduct of international relations for generations to come. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not, of course, erupt in a geopolitical vacuum. It was born from the fertile, poisoned soil of the Cold War, a decades-long, deeply entrenched ideological, economic, political, and military struggle between the United States and its Western allies, championing capitalism and liberal democracy, and the Soviet Union with its formidable communist bloc, each side convinced of the inherent malevolence and existential threat posed by the other. This was a conflict waged not primarily through direct, large-scale, conventional combat between the superpowers, for the advent of nuclear weapons had made such a prospect unthinkable, but through a shadowy, global chessboard of proxy wars in distant lands, relentless espionage, pervasive propaganda designed to win hearts and minds, and, most ominously, a terrifying, ever-escalating nuclear arms race. Both nations, driven by fear and suspicion, had amassed colossal arsenals of atomic and thermonuclear weapons, capable of obliterating each other, and indeed much of the planet, many times over. Their security, paradoxically, rested on the horrifyingly precarious balance of terror embodied in MAD. A key, and increasingly volatile, focal point of this Cold War tension in the Western Hemisphere was the island nation of Cuba, a mere 90 miles of ocean separating it from the coast of Florida. In 1959, a charismatic and determined revolutionary named Fidel Castro led a popular uprising that overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro subsequently, and to Washington's profound alarm, aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union, establishing a communist outpost on America's very doorstep. This development was an anathema to successive U.S. administrations, a perceived intolerable intrusion into America's traditional sphere of influence. In April 1961, the newly inaugurated Kennedy administration suffered a significant and deeply embarrassing foreign policy humiliation with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, a covert, ill-conceived, and poorly executed CIA-backed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. This fiasco not only served to consolidate Castro's power and push him further into the Soviet embrace, but also significantly heightened his, and indeed Moscow's, paranoia about future American attempts at regime change through direct military intervention. It was against this tense and volatile backdrop that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, a man known for his folksy earthiness, his shrewd political maneuvering, and his occasional bouts of impulsive brinkmanship, made a daring, strategically audacious, and ultimately incredibly dangerous gamble. In the late spring and summer of 1962, Under conditions of extreme secrecy and elaborate deception, the Soviet Union began the clandestine shipment and deployment of medium-range ballistic missiles, MRBMs, and, subsequently, intermediate-range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, along with their nuclear warheads and supporting infrastructure, to the island of Cuba. Khrushchev's motivations for this provocative move were multifaceted and subject to much historical debate. Primarily, and perhaps most genuinely, he aimed to deter another U.S. invasion of Cuba, thereby protecting his revolutionary ally Fidel Castro and preserving a valuable Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Strategically, the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba would dramatically alter the existing nuclear balance of power. It would directly counter the American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, NATO allies bordering the Soviet Union, which Moscow viewed as a direct and unacceptable threat. These missiles in Cuba would, for the first time, place most major American cities within easy range of Soviet nuclear weapons, drastically reducing warning times and eroding America's sense of geographical invulnerability. Furthermore, Khrushchev, ever conscious of Soviet prestige and his own political standing both at home and on the world stage, likely sought to project an image of Soviet strength and resolve, challenging American dominance in its own backyard and perhaps hoping to leverage the Cuban deployment for concessions in other Cold War hotspots, most notably the perennially tense situation in divided Berlin. It seems clear, however, in retrospect, that he critically miscalculated President Kennedy's likely reaction and the sheer intensity of the American response to such a direct and overt strategic challenge. The ensuing crisis would revolve around the decisions, perceptions, and interactions of three pivotal figures, each operating under immense pressure and with vastly different perspectives and objectives. John F. Kennedy, the relatively young and charismatic U.S. president, had been tested early in his term by the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the construction of the Berlin Wall. He was determined not to appear weak or indecisive in the face of Soviet provocation, acutely aware of both domestic political pressures and the imperatives of international credibility. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was a complex and often contradictory figure, a de-Stalinizer at home, yet a proponent of peaceful coexistence, who was also prone to bold, risky gambles designed to bolster Soviet prestige and secure strategic advantages. And Fidel Castro, the fiery, fiercely independent Cuban revolutionary leader, was driven by a profound, and not entirely unfounded, fear of American aggression and a fervent desire to protect his revolution and his island's sovereignty, even if it meant embracing the terrifying risks of nuclear confrontation. Their individual psychologies, their interpretations of each other's signals, their willingness to escalate, and their eventual, reluctant capacity to step back from the abyss, would determine the fate of millions, perhaps billions, of lives. The first inkling of the impending storm came on Sunday, October 14, 1962. A United States Air Force U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, piloted by Major Richard Hazer, soared miles above western Cuba on what was ostensibly a routine photographic mission. The images it captured, however, were anything but routine. When intelligence analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center meticulously examined the developed film the following day, they made a chilling and unmistakable discovery. Clear, irrefutable photographic evidence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile launch sites under construction. Within days, subsequent U-2 flights would reveal sites for longer-range, intermediate-range ballistic missiles as well, along with Soviet Il-28 Beagle bombers capable of delivering nuclear payloads. These missiles, armed with devastating nuclear warheads, possessed the capability to strike major American cities from Washington, D.C. to Dallas, from New Orleans to New York, within a terrifyingly short span of mere minutes from launch, drastically reducing any effective warning time and fundamentally altering the strategic landscape. On the morning of Tuesday, October 16th, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy broke the grave news to President Kennedy. The evidence was undeniable. The Soviet Union had been caught in a monumental act of deception, having previously assured the U.S. that any military assistance to Cuba was purely defensive in nature. The president, though outwardly calm, was reportedly shocked and angered by the audacity of the Soviet move. He immediately convened a highly secret group of his most trusted and senior advisors, an ad hoc body that quickly became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or simply ExComm. For nearly a week, this diverse group, which included Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the President's brother and closest confidant, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, CIA Director John McCone, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, and other key diplomatic, military, and intelligence figures, met in intense, often grueling, around-the-clock sessions in the secure confines of the White House. They grappled with the terrifying reality of Soviet nuclear missiles poised just off America's shores and fiercely debated the momentous question of how the United States should respond. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the stakes unimaginably high, the options all fraught with peril. A wide spectrum of potential courses of action was meticulously examined and fiercely debated within ExComm. Some advisors, initially, argued for a purely diplomatic approach, perhaps through the United Nations, or even for doing nothing overtly, fearing that any direct action could trigger an uncontrollable escalation. These options, however, were quickly dismissed by most as too weak, an unacceptable acquiescence to such a blatant and dangerous Soviet provocation that would severely damage American credibility worldwide. At the other end of the spectrum, many of the military leaders, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, forcefully advocated for immediate and decisive military action, a surgical airstrike to destroy the missile sites, to be followed swiftly by a full-scale invasion of Cuba to remove Castro's regime and eliminate the Soviet presence entirely. This aggressive path, however, was fraught with immense risks. What if the airstrikes failed to destroy all the missiles, leaving some operational? What if Soviet military personnel in Cuba were killed in the attack, compelling Khrushchev to retaliate? An invasion would inevitably mean heavy American and Cuban casualties, a prolonged and bloody conflict, with the ever-present, terrifying danger of a Soviet military response elsewhere in the world, most likely against the vulnerable Allied enclave of West Berlin. Gradually, through days of intense deliberation, often heated argument, and profound soul-searching, another option began to gain favor, championed particularly by Secretary of Defense McNamara and Robert Kennedy, a naval blockade, or, as it was more diplomatically and less belligerently termed, a quarantine, around Cuba. This would aim to prevent any further offensive military equipment, particularly missiles and their components, from reaching the island. A quarantine was still a direct act of confrontation, a clear challenge to the Soviet Union, but it was perceived as a more measured, less immediately escalatory response than an airstrike or invasion. It offered a show of American resolve while still providing both sides with time and space, precious commodities in a nuclear crisis, for diplomacy to work, for messages to be exchanged, and for a way out of the escalating standoff to be found. Throughout these critical initial days of discovery and secret deliberation, an extraordinary, almost unprecedented level of secrecy was maintained by the Kennedy administration. President Kennedy deliberately continued his public schedule, attending political rallies and meetings, determined to project an image of normalcy to the American public and the wider world, and, crucially, to avoid tipping off the Soviets and triggering any preemptive action on their part before a considered American course of action had been definitively chosen and prepared. But behind the carefully constructed facade of business as usual, in the secure, soundproofed confines of the White House Cabinet Room and Oval Office, the atmosphere was electric with tension, the burden of decision weighing heavily, as the fate of the world hung precariously in the balance. On the evening of Monday, October 22, 1962, the period of secret deliberation ended. President John F. Kennedy, his face etched with gravity, addressed a stunned American public and a deeply anxious world via television and radio. In a speech that would become one of the most chilling and momentous pronouncements of the Cold War era, he revealed the unmistakable evidence, supported by stark aerial photographs, of Soviet offensive nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. Sites capable of striking major cities across the breadth of the Western Hemisphere. He denounced this secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup of communist missiles as a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo which cannot be accepted by this country, if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. Kennedy then announced his administration's initial response, the immediate imposition of a strict naval quarantine, a term chosen carefully to avoid the more belligerent, act of war connotations of a blockade under international law, on all offensive military equipment being shipped to Cuba. He made it unequivocally clear that any vessel, from any nation, found carrying such prohibited cargo and attempting to run the quarantine line would be stopped and, if necessary, turned back by force. But the most dire warning was yet to come. Crucially, he delivered a stark and unambiguous message directly to Moscow. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The U.S. military was immediately placed on heightened alert status, eventually reaching DEFCON 2, Defense Condition 2, the alert level just one step short of imminent, actual war, for the first and only confirmed time in American history. Strategic Air Command bombers, armed with nuclear weapons, were dispersed to airfields across the country and maintained on constant airborne alert. The world plunged into a state of acute, palpable anxiety. The abstract, horrifying prospect of nuclear war, a specter that had haunted global consciousness since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, now felt terrifyingly real, immediate, and perhaps unavoidable. Families across America, and indeed around the globe, stocked up on canned goods and emergency supplies, schools conducted often futile duck and cover, air raid drills, and leaders in capitals worldwide issued urgent appeals for calm, restraint, and a peaceful resolution. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, the Security Council convened an emergency session. It was there that U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, in a now legendary confrontation, famously challenged his Soviet counterpart, Valerian Zorin, to admit to the presence of the missiles, declaring with icy resolve that he was prepared to wait until hell freezes over. For an answer, before dramatically unveiling the damning U-2 reconnaissance photographs for the assembled delegates in the world press to see. The newly established naval quarantine line around Cuba became the immediate, highly charged flashpoint. U.S. Navy warships, a formidable ring of steel, took up their assigned positions in the Atlantic and Caribbean, tasked with intercepting any Soviet vessels suspected of carrying offensive weaponry towards the island. For several agonizing, tension-filled days, the world watched and waited as a flotilla of Soviet cargo ships, some undoubtedly carrying additional missile components or related military equipment, steamed inexorably towards the American blockade. This was the ultimate, high-stakes game of nuclear chicken. As U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk would later famously, if somewhat apocryphally, remark about one particularly critical moment when Soviet ships appeared to halt just short of the line, we were eyeball to eyeball. And I think the other fellow just blinked. Indeed, some Soviet ships did conspicuously stop dead in the water or alter their course, avoiding a direct, potentially explosive confrontation at sea. But the crisis was far from over. The missile sites already in Cuba were still being rapidly assembled and brought closer to operational status with each passing hour. Behind the public posturing and military maneuvers, a frantic, complex, and often contradictory exchange of messages began to flow between Kennedy in Washington and Khrushchev in Moscow, sometimes through official diplomatic channels, sometimes through more unorthodox, clandestine back channels. On Friday, October 26th, Khrushchev sent President Kennedy a long, emotional, and somewhat rambling private letter. In it, amid protestations of peaceful intent, he seemed to offer a potential pathway out of the escalating crisis. The Soviet Union would agree to remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly pledged not to invade the island nation. But the very next day, Saturday, October 27th, a second, much harsher, and more formal letter arrived from Moscow, this one publicly broadcast, adding a significant and complicating new demand. The removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a NATO ally directly bordering the Soviet Union. This second letter threw ExComm into further turmoil, as advisors debated which communication represented Khrushchev's true position and how best to respond without appearing to capitulate or to escalate the crisis further. It was Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, who played a crucial role in shaping the American response, ingeniously suggesting that they publicly address and accept the terms of the more conciliatory first letter, while largely ignoring the more problematic demands of the second, a diplomatic gambit later dubbed the trollop ploy by some historians. Saturday, October 27, 1962, would forever be seared into the memories of those who lived through it as Black Saturday, the darkest, most dangerous, and most terrifyingly unpredictable day of the entire 13-day crisis. An American U-2 spy plane, on a reconnaissance mission over Cuba and piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was shot down by a Soviet-supplied SA-2 surface-to-air missile. Major Anderson was killed, becoming the only direct combat fatality of the crisis. This act dramatically escalated tensions to an almost unbearable level. Hawkish military advisors within ExComm strenuously pressured President Kennedy to retaliate immediately and forcefully against the Cuban SAM sites, a move that could very well have triggered a full-blown Soviet military response and plunged the world into war. Adding to the almost surreal strain and the heightened risk of accidental escalation, another U-2 on a routine air sampling mission near the North Pole accidentally, due to navigational error, strayed deep into Soviet airspace over the Siberian Peninsula, nearly provoking an interception by Soviet fighter jets. For a terrifying period on Black Saturday, it seemed as though events were spiraling uncontrollably out of control, driven by miscalculation, accident, and the intense pressures of the moment, pushing the world ever closer to the nuclear abyss. Unbeknownst to the American leadership at the time, Soviet submarines operating near the quarantine line around Cuba were armed with tactical nuclear torpedoes, and at least one submarine commander, under immense stress after being depth-charged by U.S. Navy ships attempting to force it to surface, was reportedly on the verge of launching his nuclear weapon, only to be heroically overruled by a cooler head, Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, who refused to give the necessary co-authorization, a chilling testament, revealed only decades later, to just how perilously close disaster truly loomed. As Black Saturday drew to its tension-soaked close, with the world seemingly balanced on a razor's edge, a desperate, last-ditch diplomatic effort was underway, operating in the shadows, away from the glare of public ultimatums and military posturing. On the evening of October 27th, with President Kennedy's authorization, Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin at the Soviet Embassy in Washington. This clandestine meeting, conducted with the utmost urgency and gravity, would prove to be the crucial, pivotal turning point of the crisis. Robert Kennedy forcefully, yet with an understanding of the need for mutual face-saving, conveyed the American position. The United States would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba if the Soviet Union agreed to remove its offensive missiles under rigorous United Nations verification. But there was another, highly sensitive, and at the time, deeply secret component to their discussion. Premier Khrushchev, in his second, public letter, had demanded the reciprocal removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Publicly acceding to this demand under the apparent duress of Soviet missiles in Cuba was politically untenable for President Kennedy. It would appear as a blatant, quid pro quo trade-off, potentially demoralizing American allies and fracturing the NATO alliance. However, in this private meeting, Robert Kennedy conveyed to Ambassador Dobrynin a carefully worded, verbal, and strictly off-the-record assurance: the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which were already considered largely obsolete by U.S. military planners and were, in fact, already scheduled for eventual removal, would indeed be quietly withdrawn some months after the Cuban crisis was fully resolved and tensions had subsided. This secret, unwritten understanding, kept hidden from the American public and even from many within the U.S. government for years, provided Khrushchev with a crucial, face-saving way to de-escalate the crisis without appearing to have completely capitulated to American pressure. The message, with its public and private components, was relayed with utmost urgency to Moscow. The world waited, suspended in an agony of uncertainty. Then, on the morning of Sunday, October 28th, Moscow radio broadcast an announcement from Premier Khrushchev that brought an almost audible sigh of relief across the globe. The Soviet Union had agreed to dismantle the offensive missile sites in Cuba and return the missiles to the Soviet Union, under appropriate United Nations verification. This would be done, Khrushchev stated, in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. The immediate, existential threat of nuclear war, which had seemed so terrifyingly imminent just hours before, had receded. While the world celebrated this reprieve, Fidel Castro in Havana was reportedly furious and felt deeply betrayed. He had not been consulted by Khrushchev on the terms of the final agreement and believed that Cuba's core security concerns and its revolutionary sovereignty had been disregarded, seeing the deal as a Soviet capitulation made at Cuba's expense. Nevertheless, the process of dismantling the Soviet missile sites in Cuba began almost immediately. Over the following tense weeks, United Nations observers, though Castro initially resisted their full, unfettered access to Cuban territory, and continued U.S. aerial surveillance confirmed the removal of the Soviet missiles and the Il-28 bombers from Cuban soil. The naval quarantine was formally lifted by President Kennedy on November 20, 1962. The world had stepped back from the brink. The immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis saw a discernible shift in the complex dynamics of the Cold War. President Kennedy's international prestige and his domestic political standing were significantly enhanced. He had successfully faced down the Soviet Union, compelling the removal of the threatening missiles, all while, crucially, avoiding the cataclysm of all-out war. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the outcome was far more ambiguous. While he could legitimately claim to have secured Cuba from a U.S. invasion and to have extracted a valuable, albeit secret, concession regarding the American missiles in Turkey, the overwhelming public perception, especially within the Soviet Union, among its Eastern Bloc allies, and in the wider communist world, was one of a humiliating strategic retreat. This perceived weakness and loss of face likely played a significant role in his ousting from power by his Kremlin colleagues 2 years later, in October 1964. Fidel Castro, though his island nation was now ostensibly safe from direct U.S. invasion, remained deeply distrustful of both superpowers and moved to solidify Cuba's position as a staunchly independent, though economically reliant, communist state within the broader Soviet sphere of influence. And, true to the secret understanding reached between Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrinin, the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy were quietly dismantled and withdrawn in the spring of 1963, a fact not widely known or publicly acknowledged until many years later. But the most profound and lasting consequences of those 13 terrifying days in October 1962 were the hard-won lessons learned by the leaders of both superpowers and indeed by the world at large. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev and their respective governments face-to-face with the horrifying, unvarnished reality of mutually assured destruction. They had peered, together, into the nuclear abyss, and the chilling vision of what they saw profoundly sobered them. One immediate and highly practical outcome was the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline in August 1963, a direct teletype communication link, not actually a red telephone, as popularly imagined. Designed to facilitate rapid, secure, and unambiguous communication between the two capitals during future crises, thereby reducing the inherent risks of miscalculation, misunderstanding, or accidental escalation. The crisis also provided a significant and undeniable impetus for renewed efforts towards nuclear arms control. Having come so perilously close to an unwinnable, world-ending war, both sides recognized the urgent, existential need to better manage their dangerous nuclear competition. This dawning realization led to landmark agreements such as the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, and it laid the groundwork for more comprehensive arms limitation talks in the years that followed, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. The world had learned, the hardest way imaginable, that nuclear weapons were not merely another category of military hardware. Their very existence fundamentally altered the nature of international conflict and posed an unprecedented threat to human survival. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a stark, enduring testament to the profound dangers inherent in superpower confrontation in the nuclear age. It highlighted with chilling clarity the critical importance of clear communication, even with one's adversaries, the extreme perils of misjudgment, misperception, and uncontrolled escalation, and the immense, almost unbearable psychological and political pressure placed upon individual leaders whose decisions, made often with incomplete information and under extreme duress, could determine the fate of all humanity. It also underscored, paradoxically, the vital role of diplomacy, the necessity of back-channel negotiations, and the courageous willingness to seek compromise and face saving off-ramps, even amidst the most intense ideological and military standoffs. Ongoing historical analysis, aided by the declassification of documents from American, Soviet, and Cuban archives, continues to reveal new layers of complexity, prompting continued debate about President Kennedy's true resolve and flexibility, Premier Khrushchev's ultimate motivations and strategic calculations, and the significant, often underappreciated, element of luck, contingency, and near misses that played a role in averting disaster. The 13 days in October 1962 were, Without question, a defining, watershed moment of the 20th century, a period when the Cold War came closest to turning catastrophically, apocalyptically hot. The Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the United States and the Soviet Union, and indeed the entire world, to the very brink of nuclear war. It was a terrifying, high-stakes poker game played with global survival itself as the ultimate pot, where a single miscalculation, a moment of unchecked aggression, or a failure of nerve could have unleashed unimaginable, irreversible devastation upon the planet. The enduring significance of the Cuban Missile Crisis lies not just in its inherently dramatic narrative of superpower confrontation, but in its deeply sobering and perpetually relevant lessons. It serves as an everlasting reminder of the profound perils of nuclear proliferation, the catastrophic potential inherent in ideological rivalries between heavily armed states, and the absolute imperative for rational, cool-headed decision-making in times of extreme international tension. The strategies employed, the immense pressures faced by leaders, and the often improvised mechanisms for de-escalation that were forged in the intense heat of those 13 days continue to inform and shape international relations and nuclear policy to this very day. It demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than any other event in modern history, that even in the darkest, most desperate hours, when the terrifying specter of global annihilation looms large, visionary leadership, careful and courageous deliberation, an unwavering commitment to communication, and a brave willingness to find and take the often politically difficult off-ramps from conflict can, indeed, avert the unthinkable and preserve the future of humankind. If you like this, subscribe, comment, and share. Bye, history lover.